Welcome back, everyone, and we're going to continue our discussion here on Chapter 5 on cell signaling and hormonal response to exercise. And with this video, we're going to focus on two key hormones that we introduced in the last video. And these hormones focus on fluid balance during exercise and normal everyday homeostasis. And so we're going to introduce the effects of the antidiuretic hormone, or ADH for short, and also the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, also known as RAAS. So before we get into our main topic, let's review what we've covered so far in this chapter. First, we have discussed the 7 major endocrine glands in the human body. And as a quick review, some of those were the anterior pituitary gland, the posterior pituitary gland, the adrenals, the thyroid. Now, I'm only showing 4 of the 7 that we covered, but within these, we discussed the different hormones that each one produces. And so, for example, the anterior pituitary gland produced several different releasing hormones that worked in conjunction with other organs to release the primary hormone to eventually work on the target tissue. And when we talked about the posterior pituitary gland, we said it released oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. And ADH is one of those hormones that we'll be discussing in this lecture. Furthermore, we broke down the adrenals into the adrenal medulla and the adrenal cortex. And we said within the adrenal cortex, it released 3 different classes of steroids. And one of those key steroids that we discussed was aldosterone. And this is the other hormone that we'll be discussing in today's lecture. Additionally, we discussed the hormone of cortisol and its effects on glucose regulation. And we discussed the thyroid hormones of T3 and T4 and their effects on metabolism. Also, we discussed how the entire mechanism between the hypothalamus through the anterior pituitary gland to the thyroid to the release of T3 and T4. Additionally, we discussed the growth hormone and its effects on how it stimulates protein synthesis and growth. It increases gluconeogenesis in the liver. And finally, we talked about how it blocks glucose entry into adipose cells in favor of fat mobilization or fat usage. Also, we discussed about the parathyroid hormone and its effects on calcium regulation within the human body. So, building upon this review of the hormones that we discussed in the previous lecture, let's move on and discuss in depth the hormone of aldosterone. So, the hormone of aldosterone, or ALD for short, is produced by the adrenal cortex. And it falls under the classification of mineralocorticoids. And so what this means is aldosterone is a steroid hormone. And if we go back to the very first lecture, we said steroid hormones work directly on its target. And so what we said is steroids are lipophilic, and so they're able to go directly through the cell membrane and then attach to the receptor and then exert their effects on their target within that particular tissue and or cell. And this is going to be the same case in our discussion for aldosterone. So when we discuss aldosterone, we need to speak about it in conjunction with a couple of other hormones. And these hormones are renin and angiotensinogen. And these 3 hormones make up the RAAS system. And so what the RAAS system is the body's long-term system to regulate fluid balance and blood pressure. And this concept of fluid balance becomes really important when we start discussing exercise. Additionally, this system is typically triggered by hypovolemia, which is by definition low blood volume. And so how do we get low blood volume? And so very quickly, when we look at the components of blood, blood is made of plasma and erythrocytes, also known as red blood cells. And so typically this portion of the blood, the red blood cells or erythrocytes, does not change. So when we start talking about changes in blood volume, the primary focus is going to be on plasma, because the components of plasma are water, white blood cells, and other components. And so when we start exercise, what happens? If we're not intaking water and also through thermoregulation, i.e. sweating, we have drop in the water concentration in our body. And so when we see this drop in water concentration, we see drops in blood volume due to that portion of blood plasma. And so when we see drops in blood volume, what we see is increases in blood viscosity. And what we mean by viscosity, we're talking about the thickness of the blood. And so this means the blood becomes harder to push. And so the blood is not getting to the target muscles and tissues necessary for oxygen delivery and so forth. And because of this is why the body wants to upkeep water concentrations in the body in order to stave off blood viscosity issues. And the other aspect that triggers the RAAS pathway is drops in blood pressure. And so with this drop in blood pressure, we'll see that occur when we have drops in blood volume caused by hypovolemia and so forth, and other factors. And so what the RAAS system does is help maintain BP. And it does it through two different mechanisms. So the RAAS system involves several different endocrine glands. And the first one that we will look at is the liver. Yes, the liver is an endocrine gland. So the liver produces the hormone angiotensinogen. And again, this is in response to changes or drops in blood volume and drops in BP. Furthermore, simultaneously, when we look at the kidneys, they produce a hormone called renin. And both these hormones come together in the bloodstream to create the byproduct angiotensin 1. And you'll also see it written in certain schematics as AG1. And so, with this occurring in the bloodstream, angiotensin 1 then travels within the bloodstream up to the lungs. And so what happens is the endothelium of the lungs produces an enzyme called the angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE for short. And what this does is convert AG1 to AG2, or angiotensin 2. And so AG2 exerts two different effects. The first is it works on the smooth muscle in the blood vessels. And by working on the smooth muscle in the blood vessels, what it does is causes vasoconstriction. And by increasing vasoconstriction, this inadvertently increases BP and systematically in the body. Also, angiotensin angiotensin 2 exerts an effect on the adrenal cortex. And remember, the adrenal cortex is found on the superior portion of the kidney lobes. And so what AG2 does is it triggers the adrenal cortex to release the hormone aldosterone. And so what aldosterone does is it works directly on the kidneys to focus on sodium reabsorption and potassium excretion. And so by doing this, by triggering the reabsorption of sodium, which causes the body to reabsorb H2O. And thus, this inadvertently increases the water concentration in the body, which then helps to alleviate drops in blood volume and also blood pressure. And so by looking at the RAAS pathway, it's a very complex system. And so with these multiple steps, it's not a quick system. This is one of those long-term systems that the body uses to regulate blood volume and BP. So this means the body has to have a short-term solution to changes in blood volume and blood pressure. And we do this, and the body does this through the usage of ADH that is released by the anterior pituitary gland. And so when we look at the effects of ADH on the body, it is triggered again by drops in blood volume and drops in BP. It does work in conjunction with the RAAS pathway. However, it's a completely different system. And so ADH is released by the posterior pituitary gland. So in response to drops in blood volume, drops in BP, also responses to increased concentrations of AG2, and increases in sympathetic nervous system activity. And so what we find is this triggers the hypothalamus here in the paraventricular nucleus to send signal down to the posterior pituitary gland to release ADH directly into the bloodstream. And so once ADH is released into the bloodstream, it exerts two different effects. The first effect is on the kidneys. And so its effect on the kidneys is it causes direct water reabsorption. And so what this inadvertently does, it causes an increase in blood volume. Now, the second effect that ADH produces is directly on the blood vessels. And so what it does is similar to angiotensin 2, it causes vasoconstriction of the smooth muscle in the blood vessels. And so by increasing vasoconstriction of the arteries and arterioles, you're inadvertently increasing systematic vascular resistance. And by increasing resistance, you increase blood pressure. So this effect that ADH has on blood pressure through increasing vascular resistance is why it has the sister name vasopressin. And so what we see with ADH, it has the dual effects of increasing blood volume through the direct reabsorption of water in the kidneys and the direct increase effects of BP through vasoconstriction of the blood vessels. And so this pathway is much shorter than the RAAS pathway. Furthermore, the effects of ADH are direct onto the target tissues. And so this is why the ADH VSP pathway is considered a short-term pathway. However, what we do see is with this pathway and the RAAS pathway, they work in conjunction with each other to help regulate blood volume and blood pressure. And so what the body inadvertently has is a short-term pathway and a long-term pathway to regulate both these elements. So in this video, we detailed how the body reacts to decreases in blood volume and decreases in blood pressure. And it does this through a couple of different hormonal responses. And so what we said is we have a long-term response through the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system, and also the short-term through the effects of aldosterone, which also has the name of vasopressin. And so both of these systems work in conjunction with each other to regulate changes in blood volume and blood pressure. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time. Take care.